This video is sponsored by Squarespace. 3D characters by Disney or Blizzard are made using teams of people, each using a bunch of different apps. In this video, I'm going to see if it's possible to make a 3D character using just a single app. You see, whenever I upload a new video showing my process, I often get asked why I don't just use Blender. My argument against this is that you wouldn't use a Swiss Army knife to open a tin when you've already bought an electric tin opener. But you raved on about it for so long that I figured, well, it can't hurt to give it a try. And the result surprised me actually, as you'll see. In this video, you're going to see me do everything from sculpting, texture painting, shading, rigging, lighting, rendering, compositing, and banana smoothies, all made with Blender. The only thing I haven't used Blender for is the concept, which was made by Angel Garnev, and you'll find it linked below. Although I'm sure Angel wouldn't have a problem drawing this using Blender. Now I will preface this by saying I love sculpting in ZBrush, and I went into this thinking that it would be a fun one-off video and my workflow would revert back to normal as soon as I finish. But was this the case? Let's start with a clip of my first impressions of sculpting with Blender.
So what I want to do is insert a sphere. No, I don't like that pole on the top. I'm going to insert a cube instead, and then subdivide. Turn symmetry on. And let's start making a head. I can't say I expect to be using Blender for sculpting all the time after this, but you know, I just thought it'd be interesting to see how we get on. Right, mask. Look at this, I'm like a pro already. I'm not, I'm struggling. Okay, let's add in a new shape for the body. I really don't want to flake out and jump into ZBrush. I mean, I'm not going to do that because then I'll have to change the name of the video and that would just be silly. So new, cube, sculpt mode, subdivide, scale and Y, box mask, invert, remesh. Why is it not letting me? This is silly. This is childish. Let's apply that. Oh, there it is. Now I can do it. Give her a bit of a cheekbone. I'm getting a bit confident now. I'm going faster than I should be. Shift F. Oh, that's strength, is it? Bring this in. Bring this out. Beautiful. It's not beautiful at all. Yet. I'm going to turn this into a masterpiece. You just wait. I really want to increase the resolution so it looks better. You must wait. Just hold your nerve for as long as you can. Come on, let's add some resolution. Just define that jaw a little bit. Imagine if I really start liking Blender sculpting and I just ditch the ZBrush. I can't do that, can I? Wonder if I'll find anything that I prefer in Blender. Kind of looks like a mouth, does it not? Try and do some eyes. Sure, why not? Should I put in some spheres? Do you know what? I can put eye designer eyes straight in. I don't even need to mess about with this, do I? That's a nice little bonus. It does actually save quite a bit of time doing it directly in Blender. I wasn't actually expecting to like sculpting in Blender this much. There are some really nice perks to using Blender that I hadn't even thought of. I'm going to have to do some serious weighing up of pros and cons after this.
So, clearly my opinion on sculpting in Blender has changed, and while I do still prefer the feel of sculpting in ZBrush, probably because I'm used to it, what I hadn't realised was just how much time is saved by not having to transfer models between apps. Because even though the Gobi add-on, which transfers models between ZBrush and Blender automatically, is amazing and saves a lot of time, there's always a little bit of discrepancy with how the model looks between the two apps, which I didn't have to contend with when sculpting directly in Blender. Another big benefit was the ability to see the sculpt from different views while I'm sculpting. It made me realise just how much time I usually spend rotating around the model to check each change that I make. I spent some time refining what I'd done, and after using some Retopology tools to quickly build some eyebrows, I was starting to feel pretty confident that Blender would have a much bigger role in my sculpting workflow, but I was keen to see how it would handle Retopology. Now I have actually retopologized in Blender a few times using the Speed Retopo add-on, and it works pretty well, but I've got to be honest, I'm so bored of Retopology now that recently I've been grabbing meshes I've already retopologized and wrapping them around my sculpt, which tends to be much quicker than doing it by hand. So I wanted to see if I could achieve this in Blender, and my initial thought was naturally to use the shrink wrap modifier. However, this proved to be quite problematic, and I was a bit short of time on this project, so in the end I just reshaped the new mesh to fairly accurately match the sculpt by hand, and carried on sculpting. I'll revisit this idea when I've got a bit more time, but this worked just fine for now, and I've still only used Blender. Next, I added in some teeth and turned the canines into fangs. Adding teeth is helpful for finding the shape of the lips, since the lips wrap around them. I then changed the shape of the ears to better match those found in the reference. For the horns, I added a curve and a circle and made the circle the bevel object of the curve. This essentially means that I can now model the horns using curves, which is really nice. It also means I can shade the horns procedurally by using a ramp node. Next, I moved on to the hair, which is fairly simple in this concept. And my usual approach is to first create a simple overall shape to represent the hair mass, before laying down hair strands over the top of it. However, since we're already in Blender, I figured I'd quickly rig the character first. This way I'll be able to create the hair while it's already in pose, saving time fixing things later on. By setting keyframes, I can easily switch between the posed and unposed model by scrubbing the timeline. Ready to start the hair now, I load up my last project and copy and paste one of the hair strands. I then repeat this process all around the head, which usually takes quite a while. So while I'm doing that, give me a few seconds to talk about Squarespace, who have sponsored this video. Now if you're looking to expand your art presence online, then you'll want to check out Squarespace. This all-in-one platform provides you with tools to build websites and online stores. So whether you want to impress potential employers with a beautiful portfolio, or you're looking to sell your digital art, Squarespace has your back. And it's really easy to set up too, at least the way I did it. I just chose the type of website I want and looked through the templates. When you find something that looks nice, you just replace the content with your own. And what's nice is that if my images don't match the size or resolution of the template, Squarespace resizes them automatically to save faffing around. Just go to squarespace.com to start a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/DannyMac3D and you'll save 10% off your first website or domain. The base of the sculpt was made by modelling this simple shape around the body of the character. Now I didn't want the body showing in the final piece, but I tend not to delete things if I can help it, just in case I need it for something later. So instead, I assigned all the verts that I didn't want to see to a vertex group and plugged it into a mask modifier, hiding the parts we don't need. Next on the to-do list was painting the skin, which I wasn't much looking forward to be honest. Usually painting skin is one of my favourite parts of the whole process, but that's because I find ZBrush really nice for it, whereas I've always found painting textures in Blender a bit clunky. True to form, I started off with performance issues, but I quickly realised that this was because I needed to turn down the resolution on my model. Now while I did continue to struggle to enjoy painting in Blender, I soon remembered that I was neglecting Blender's procedural tools. Being able to tweak the colour of the ambient occlusion in real time is definitely a perk of texturing in Blender. I can also use a node or two to change the texture to orange, an idea I'll revisit later when making the blue portion of the skin. But for now, I want to model those earrings before I forget. These were made really simply using a cube which was modelled into this basic shape. Again, I was able to shade them procedurally using a ramp node, like I did with the horns. Now at this point I ran into what I'd call a big issue when it comes to texturing in Blender. Now when you paint in Blender, the app wants you to manually save textures to an image file onto your computer. Now this in itself isn't a bad thing, and Blender does remind you to do this if you try shutting it down without. However, even though I'm in the habit of saving my scene file every few minutes, I had totally forgot to save out the texture. Then at some seemingly random point in time, Blender decides to erase the work I've done on my texture. Now fortunately for me, it wasn't the most detailed texture work, so it didn't take me long to repaint it, but I can see this being a much harder lesson for some people. After this, I noticed that in the concept the eyes were different colour, and since the eyes shared the same material, changing one side would mean changing both. So to get around this, I selected the left iris and made a new instance of the material by clicking this number next to the material name. Now when I change the colour, it only affects the left eye. The next thing I did was make a blue version of the skin. Essentially, I just duplicated the original nodes and tweaked them until I had a colour that I liked. Now at this point I'm starting to think that this skin would look a lot better with a roughness map. So for this I applied a temporary flat grey material so I could better see the result as I worked. Now the point of this map is to tell Blender which part of the skin you want to be shiny and which parts you want to be matte, and has quite a profound effect on the final look. Again, since we're in Blender, I took advantage of its procedural shading and added in some overall noise to break the texture up a bit. To create the effects of the character's skin flaking off like shown in the concept, the first idea I had was to paint a mask. The idea being that anywhere that I painted white would reveal the orange texture, then anywhere painted black would show the blue. This almost worked as treat, but unfortunately it didn't add any thickness, so it looked more like face paint than thick flaking skin. So I decided to try again using geometry instead. I duplicated the head and deleted the parts I didn't need before adding thickness with the solidify modifier. The thickness definitely looks better, but the current topology caused awful shading problems, and I would need the mesh to be extremely dense to sculpt the details I wanted. I also ran into a bunch of random problems too. A bit frustrated, I decided to move on to the hands with the intention of coming back to this later. Now on this occasion I didn't create the hands from scratch, but instead used a rigged hand which I sculpted to suit my character. However, I'm going to gloss over this for now because it's something I want to talk about in detail in an upcoming video. So make sure you're subscribed if you're not already and click the bell so you don't miss it. Still unsure what to do with the skin, I moved on to the flaky pieces, which are essentially just reshaped cubes with a bevel modifier. Then I played around with the lighting, but I was struggling to get nice shadows while simultaneously getting a nicely placed eye highlight. Then I remembered I have the fake highlight feature on my iDesigner add-on, and I've never actually really used it before, so I decided now was a great time to start. Now when I'm lighting the model, I'm free to focus on the shadows without worrying about the eyes. Now this is great and all, but I still haven't addressed the issues I was facing with the face, but I decided to sleep on it, which turned out to be a good move because as I lay there trying to sleep, I came up with a solution to the problem, which in hindsight seems pretty obvious. Remember the mask I created that determines which part of the skin is orange? Well, all I needed to do was plug that into a bump node and I can create the illusion that the orange part of the skin has depth. I did bump into a problem with shading at the UV seams, but this is quite easily solved by increasing the bleed value of the brush. Other than that, painting the depth turned out to be quite fun. And to create the glare effect on the earring, I added another ramp node and used it to drive an emission shader. Then after a bunch of minor tweaking, I rendered out the image so that I could move on to compositing. Normally I composite images in Photoshop, and the first thing I do is add colour correction, so that's what I did here. It definitely behaves differently to Photoshop, but I started getting the hang of it. Next I wanted to try bringing back the lens flare on the earrings, so I added a glare node and played around with the settings. I then spent a good while just experimenting with different nodes and working out what they did, which was fun, but time was pressing to finish the piece. So to speed things up, I bought a compositing add-on for Blender called Enrich, which reintroduces the familiar layer workflow found in Photoshop. This allowed me to make the changes that I needed without having to work out how to set it up using nodes. It also gave me the opportunity to learn the nodes anyway, since I was able to watch the graph being built with each change that I made. Before we see the final image, you might be wondering what I thought of working solely in Blender, and if I plan to make this a regular thing. Well, I must say I was definitely impressed by how much time I saved sculpting in Blender, and I probably will start using it as my primary sculpting tool. Now, I still much prefer how ZBrush performs and how the brushes feel, but I can't ignore how much time I save by sculpting in the app that I do almost all the rest of the pipeline with. And besides, if and when I want to use a feature that I prefer to use ZBrush for, such as painting skin textures, I can quickly send my model over there using the Gobi add-on, so I get the best of both worlds. The only other major difference to my usual workflow was compositing, which, as I say, I usually do in Photoshop, and in this case, I think it'll remain that way, at least for now. Now, the main thing Photoshop has over Blender for compositing is speed. It changes in Photoshop are instant, whereas in Blender it can often take a few moments to calculate, even after taking steps to improve performance. Now, unfortunately, this was just too much of a problem for me, but I will continue to experiment to see how I can incorporate these tools into my workflow more. Now, all in all, I'm glad I did this experiment, because I learned a lot of little things about Blender that I didn't know before, and I think they all contribute towards an ever-evolving and improving workflow. But most importantly, it reminded me to keep an open mind about the tools that I use and about the tools that I don't, which is something I think we can all do with being reminded of once in a while. See you in the next one.